To day three. Welcome everybody to day three of the Korean American Ethnic Studies 7 webinar series. My name is Jeff Kim, the facilitator of today's workshop. Before we get started, this is a national conference, the institute that we have here, the 7 webinar series. We have folks from California and folks all across our country. And I just heard very recently that we have some participants. They have been affected by Hurricane Ida and displaced. Also, we know that there's events happening all around the world, including Afghanistan. So I just want to take a moment for us to remember how blessed we are, but also to remember these fellow Americans all across the world today. The purpose of this webinar is to establish a forum of discussion with our Korean American history scholars and educators in order to share their expertise, current status, and future plans for Korean ethnic studies. And so we do thank our sponsors, which include the Consulate General of the Republic of Korea in Los Angeles, especially Consul Che, who has been so supportive of the entire team, attending all our meetings and giving us all kinds of advice and counsel, as well as the Korean American Ethnic Studies Advisory Committee and ICANN International Korean Educators Network. We began session 1 with interethnic relations as we examined the LA riots of 1992. In session 2, we asked the driving question, what makes a community leader? As we looked at Dosan An Chang-ho, founder of Pachapa Camp of the first Korean American community. And at this time, I would like to introduce the person that will give opening remarks, Dr. Edward Park, professor and chair of Asians and Asian American Studies at Loyola Marymount University. Dr. Park received his PhD in ethnic studies from the University of California, Berkeley, with research topics including migration, race relations. And I've also known Dr. Park, one of the most favorite lecturers I love listening to from the Korean institutes that we led in Irvine. So Dr. Park, I hand it to you for some opening remarks at this time.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much. And thank you to all the organizers of the webinar. And it is a pleasure to spend this time with you. It's my honor to introduce Professor John Park, who's a professor of Asian American Studies at the Department of at UC Santa Barbara. In addition to being a prolific scholar and a dedicated teacher, John Park is also my younger brother. And so it gives me double the pleasure of introducing such a fine family member as well as a professional colleague. I think, whenever John and I write on Korean Americans and for our participation in this effort to put additional Korean American content into the K through 12 curriculum, I think we are really motivated by the memories of our mother, whose quiet labor and struggle and life really made our 2 lives possible. And I think of all the Korean Americans, from the very earliest pioneers to that big wave of immigrants who came, after the 1965 Immigration Act, how their sacrifice and their encouragement supports this generation of Korean American scholars and teachers. And, it is our hope that through our collective effort, the state of California and this country recognizes all the contributions that Korean Americans have made, including from the heroes of our community, people like Dr. Sammy Lee, but also to ordinary folks who toiled away as seamstresses in Los Angeles Garment District, all the way to owning shops in South Central LA, to other parts of this country. So once Professor Park gets seated, it's my pleasure to turn over the attention, I guess it's not the podium, to John Park. Thank you.
Thank you, Big Brother. I'm sorry, that was another member of my family calling me on the phone. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much to the organizers. Thank you to the Big Brother for such a wonderful introduction. And I'm pleased to be with you today. Ed and I worked on a much longer manuscript on Korean and Korean American history. And I was just very thrilled that the Korean consulate for many years now has tried to develop lesson plans like the one I'm going to present to you, so that kids in California public schools can learn about Korean and Korean American history earlier. Yeah. Oh. Wait, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so here. Why is this not working? How's that?
Looks very good, Dr. Park.
All right, great. Yeah, and we developed both a manuscript for teachers, and then we worked on lesson plans. And this is, I worked on Dr. Sammy Lee. And what a fascinating life. And I'm gonna try to keep my presentation short. I gather that, you know, the webinar has been more driven by participants and driven by your questions. So I will try, and Ed, if I go past 10 minutes, just, you have my permission to tell me to be quiet. And it is an occupational hazard. So, you know, professors go on and on sometimes. So I'll try to keep my remarks short. So Dr. Sammy Lee is quite significant in Korean American history because he was such a public figure. So he was born in Fresno. His family is a farming family. They had come to to California about 10 years before he was born. And shortly after the annexation of Korea by the Japanese Empire. Yeah. During the 1910s and 1920s, the families tried to do farming, to be farmers, but because of the alien land laws in California, they eventually had to give up those plans. So, and this is, you know, the reason why Sammy Lee's life is so important and so significant is that he does straddle two very important periods in American history. The earlier period, American law was quite white supremacist, it was quite racist. So, you know, I teach in comparative ethnic studies. I've been doing it for 20 years or so. And I'm a legal scholar, and I study primarily immigration rules and citizenship rules in California and in the United States. The alien land laws passed first in 1913 with a newer version in 1920 forbade persons ineligible for citizenship for owning land. And this included all persons of Asian ancestry. Yeah, so part of the reason why Sammy Lee's life is so significant, I mean, the family faced pretty significant structural racism, which caused them to abandon their original plans. His father became a shopkeeper in Los Angeles. And then as young Sammy here was going to school, in his biography, he admits himself he was not the most serious student. He didn't particularly care for school. He really liked athletics, and he really took up diving. And Olympic diving coach saw him one day in Pasadena, decided to coach him. Right. So this is Jim Ryan was already an Olympic level coach when he took Sammy Lee under his teaching, taught him how to do acrobatic moves. And in fact, you know, Sammy Lee was apparently amazing. One of the first American divers, not just Korean, but like American divers to do many acrobatic things in the air before he hit the water. Here he is, you can see him on the right as an undergraduate at Occidental College. Throughout his college years, he competed in national competitions. He became the first national diving champion of Asian ancestry in the United States. And he was well on the way to the Olympic Games, but of course, World War II prevented that. So instead of going to the Olympics during 1940 and 1944, he went to medical school. So he got a special scholarship, and this is again a very important pivot. So during a moment when many of his Japanese American friends in Southern California were being incarcerated during World War II, persons of Chinese and Korean ancestry often had new opportunities presented to them. They were not incarcerated. They had access to special scholarships that allowed them to pursue college degrees, and then in the case of Dr. Lee, medical school. He went to USC, and he went to USC under a special program through which, at the end of medical school, he would agree to be a medical officer for the US Army. Again, this is unusual. Prior to the 1940s, these kinds of opportunities were typically off limits to persons of Asian ancestry. But as the United States becomes more of a world leader, it situates itself as a leader of the free world, as opposed to the communists and to the fascists. Dr. Lee's life really does take an enormous pivot. And after World War II, you can see in 1948, he does get to compete in London. He's actually one of the older Olympians. So, he's in his late 20s when he wins his first gold medal in the Olympic Games in London. And he won 2 Olympic medals during that Olympics. Throughout that entire period, his senior officers allowed him to practice, to keep diving, even though he was commissioned as an officer and serving in the US Army the entire time, such that 4 years later, he becomes the first American Olympian to repeat 2 gold medal performances in back-to-back Olympics. It's amazing. I mean, I had the pleasure of looking at newspaper accounts of Sammy Lee's diving performances. Apparently they were electrifying, right? So not only did he win gold, it wasn't even close. The combination of acrobatics, the way he did the 3-meter platform and then the 10-meter platform. He was an amazing diver, and he had natural talent. So not only was he diving successfully for gold medals, he was also a diving coach. He began coaching younger divers, even as he was competing in the Olympic Games. And his life is quite significant because there just aren't that many, there aren't that many Asian American men in the 1940s and 1950s who were as visible, as prominent. Some of his diving, especially in the 1950s, was televised. So, and being televised, the United States emerging from World War II as the most powerful nation on the planet, and the biggest issue or problem in the United States was that America's communist adversaries were constantly accusing the United States of being so white supremacist and being racist, which was kind of true. I mean, like if you looked at America in the 1940s and 1950s, American public law set many, many deeply unfortunate examples, right? So that, and this is, I think, and I'm fully aware that I'm talking mostly to teachers, and I'm talking to teachers who are teaching younger people. And I think it would be very difficult to teach younger people just how pervasive white supremacy was in American law, right? But it was so pervasive that in the period before World War II, many Nazi scholars studied in the United States. And when they rewrote German law to be more white supremacist, they used and drew from American examples. In light of that history, right, the images that we see here of senior American generals shaking hands with a person of color, right, who's also an officer, the American president meeting with prominent African Americans and Dr. Sammy Lee, is Asian American. This is a signal that the American government and that American diplomats want to give to assure the rest of the world that the United States is not going to be white supremacist anymore, that the United States is going to try harder to be less racist. Yeah, and especially in the 1950s, as the United States is embroiled in the first shooting war of the Cold War in Korea. Dr. Sammy Lee's presence there, both as a medical officer serving during the war, and then as I guess as a diplomat athlete, right, giving diving competitions in Korea throughout the 1950s. It's a sign that the United States will want allies in Asia, that the United States will be less racist to Asians in general, that the United States will try to be the multiracial democracy that it really hadn't been before 1950. Yeah. And of course, you know, the legacy of white supremacy in the United States is such that it doesn't all disappear at once. So here is, you know, Sammy Lee's one of the most widely traveled Asian American diplomat athletes. He gave diving exhibitions everywhere that he went. But when he went back to Southern California, and he and his wife tried to find a place to live, Anaheim and Orange County and Garden Grove in Orange County, the racially restrictive covenants in those areas were such that real estate agents would refuse to sell or even show them certain houses. You see what I mean? I mean, it's such a telling sign of the long tail of white supremacy in American society, right? That both this Olympian and American diplomat now and this distinguished veteran of the US Army still can't live in predominantly white areas of Garden Grove or Anaheim, right? They eventually moved to Costa Mesa, but largely because the subdivision in Costa Mesa where they moved to was so new, it didn't have a racially restricted, and yeah, it's an incredible and compelling story, right? Just after he retires from the United States Army, he has a very long career as both a diving coach as well as a doctor. So he's like a practicing physician for most of the 1960s and 70s. He really retired quite late. I mean, he retired near his 80th birthday, right? And as I learned this afternoon, he had a very colorful sense of humor. Yeah, and he was one of the most influential diving coaches in the late 20th century for the US Olympic team. With those remarks, I'm going to conclude. I think I went about 2 minutes over, but I am very curious to hear whatever questions you might have, right? And I'm very happy to answer any of them.
Dr. Park, what a powerful story of resilience. Ethnic studies and the story of Dr. Sammy Lee gives us the opportunity to grow through some of the painful experiences like exclusion, segregation, discrimination, while also highlighting the remarkable achievements, including the remarkable achievements of Korean Americans. So thank you for sharing this story. I believe we wanted to take a class photo. Is that right, Ms. Shim?
Yeah, we do. And Dr. Edward Park has a surprise for us.
Oh, what is the surprise?
Right, what we're about to see. So he had shared with me this photo. I'm going to.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite photographs, right? In fact, it's so funny that Ed is showing this photo because I have it in my office.
Oh, wow. Great. You guys are like great minds thinking alike. That's amazing.
Right. There was a little lapse in the communication. And let's see. So, you know, when I was talking about my mother, the image was supposed to be up, but I didn't realize that I had control over the screen. Part of it was to sort of highlight, you know, this as sort of a family business and this as a way of, you know, memorializing
Mhm.
our beloved mother, who
Yeah,
is
it's
no longer
lovely.
with us, but I think is, really a driving force of what we do.
Mhm.
I also was
agree.
sort of debating between this image and image of our children. So John and I, between us, we have 5 children, and so I think, the big motivation also for participating in this project was to make sure that our children and their children will have access to this, important information
Absolutely.
and knowledge. So
Mhm.
that's the rationale behind the photo. And
Thank
I
you.
also wanted John
Your
to get a little
mother looks
emotional
so young in
and
this
serious
picture.
to start his presentation.
Thank you so much for sharing that story, Dr.
Yeah.
Park. And it just reminds us that I think sometimes the migrational or generational story, especially of immigrants, especially of Korean Americans, oftentimes we didn't have the chance to honor our families. We didn't have that chance to honor their memories and the stories. In fact, we don't even know the story sometimes. And so the fact that now these stories are being curated, these stories are being archived for future generations, we appreciate your scholarly and good work. Thank you so much for doing that.
Can I say something before we go into Q&A? One of the things I think I should have mentioned about Dr. Sammy's life is he said that when he was younger, when he was in grammar school, he often felt ashamed of being Korean. That he once told his father he hated being Korean. White kids would pick on him, right? They would tease him. He was short. He was, he tried to be athletic, but a lot of kids, and they could be quite brutal and mean at that age. And he said, reflecting back on his childhood, that he had to unlearn a lot of the kind of like hostility that he felt toward his own identity as well as toward his family, right? So as he became an older person, it was as though having lived in a society where people like him were treated in such ways, he had a lot of what the sociologists might call internalized racism. Yeah, and I think part of the reason why we ought to teach these topics to younger people earlier is because we can use these biographical accounts to help them process things that they themselves might be going through. Yeah, and it can resonate with them in a way that I think is incredibly powerful.
Thank you for adding that piece, Dr. Park. I think when you don't know your story, oftentimes a person might feel a sense of shame. And so when a person that's a Korean American knows their story, I think that's a story of resilience. That's a story that can give them strength, but not just for Korean Americans. When other groups also know the stories of different groups, I think it strengthens them as well. So thank you for adding that point. I'm going to hand it over to Miss Ginny to help us with that class photo.
All righty, so it's that time. You know what to do. You want to check your hair. Thank you. Every time we do this, thank you for having your cameras on. I know some of you are maybe even driving, so you're just listening. Some of you just cannot have cameras on. That's totally fine. But with all the speakers today, we wanted to take a photo. So last time, I know we did the 사랑해, the finger heart. Well, it's another thing that a lot of Koreans do when we take group photos is 화이팅. 화이팅 is kind of like, we can do it. Let's go, let's go. So maybe today we'll try that one, okay? All righty. So I will give you a count of 3 and please hold your poses for like 3 seconds because I'm gonna need to toggle to the next screen. So 3, 2, 1, fighting and hold it. One more time. Fighting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ginny. We're going to look back at these photos and have some good laughs, I'm sure. At this point, I'd like to go ahead and introduce another faculty member, Dr. Grace Choi, faculty member at Cal State University, Fullerton. I first met Dr. Grace when she was chair of secondary education at Cal State Fullerton. And I'll tell you this whole institute, this webinar series big component of this is because of her leadership in bringing faculty and teachers together to talk about these lessons. And today she'll be discussing supplementary lessons to support with this ethnic studies curriculum on Dr. Sammy Lee. I hand it over to Dr. Grace Cho.
Thank you for the introduction, Jeff. Actually, I go by Cho in school. My married last name is Choi, but either way is fine. Good afternoon, everyone. It's so nice seeing you all again. Yeah, many of you. Thank you, Dr. John Park, for providing us such an informative and thorough background and personal insight about Dr. Sammy Lee's story. Since we started sharing personal stories, let me share my one, why I started getting involved with this task. Actually, one day my youngest daughter, who was in 6th grade, she came home from school and she was all sad and gloomy. And she was complaining about how biased and limited her world history textbook was. And she explained to me that they were learning about Chinese Empire, and the whole chapter was based on Chinese people's perspectives, but nothing from other people like Mongolians or Tibets and all that. And also, she also said that in 6th grade, the only 2 Asian groups she learned was Chinese and Indian. And she looked through the 7th grade, she just turned 7th grade, and look at the textbook, and she saw, okay, one more Asian group was added. That was Japanese group. So there was only 3 Asian groups still in the history book. And so actually she said that she had expressed this concern to her 6th grade teacher. And the teacher said that, oh, everyone will learn about different groups when they start going to college. So at first I was surprised at the teacher's response, since she was one of the most seasoned teacher in her school. But at the same time, I thought, I understand why teachers are having fear to include other perspectives and all that. First of all, some of the challenges as a teacher is there are too many topics and concepts to cover in a semester or in a year, right? We are pressured to meet content standard, but not enough training on how to integrate teaching materials, and then at the same time meeting the teaching standards. And certainly many teachers, including my husband who is teacher too, they don't have time to investigate or research to show different perspectives. Therefore, they end up covering the content of whatever the textbook is saying. So I'm sure many of us had a similar experience in teaching, and definitely my student teaching that I did in 20 some years ago in 6th grade happened the same thing. I was busy covering the textbook. But this conversation actually gave me a wake-up call that I need to do something about it. And that's what motivated me to get involved with this ethnic studies curriculum development task. And thanks to the consulate office that we are getting some fund to develop this. But I also see more reason to continue sharing Korean American stories to others through webinars, through conferences, and also to continue developing reference resource materials for teachers. And my hope is that by the time my youngest daughter goes to high school, teachers are trained to take more balanced approach in teaching, and also stories of Korean American experience and other minority groups' contribution to the US will be heard in schools. And all students will be inspired and motivated in learning the contribution of minority group and be proud of who they are, regardless of the status of America. And actually, it is true. It's not only Dr. Sammy Lee who was shamed about being Korean American. I did conducted research on 2nd generation Korean Americans, and many of them had that resistance of that they hated being Korean American and showing all that. So I think more and more we need this kind of training workshop, whatever you can call it. But anyway, let's dive into Dr. Sammy Lee's story and see how we can make this rich resources that Dr. John Park has developed it, but make it more digestible for our students. So let me share my screen. Yeah, I know I made it a little more colorful to brighten up our days. Okay. So Dr. John Park, he did an excellent job writing and also explaining today the details about Dr. Sammy Lee's biography. But in his original lesson packet, which you can get it from this hyperlink. Let me show you. So computer is a little slow, but he in his lesson plan is an autobiographical document. He did include some biographical overview, lesson plan for 8th grade students, 11th grade, some reference for Dr. Lee's related lesson, timeline of his life, and also some selected images. So it is really important to look at what he wrote to get the background information. Okay, and so from that lesson, since it's a quite extensive document, I divided into 3 different topics that teachers can use, can teach. One topic is first of all, who is Dr. Sammy Lee? And then later, public laws discriminating against Asians, which his parents went through and all that. And then Dr. Lee's contribution to diplomacy. And within this, some of the key terms, oh, sorry. Oh, it keep bouncing back. Oh, okay. Okay, right here. Some of the key terms and concepts that you can find, especially in the middle section about the public law discriminating against Asians, are this law that actually Dr. Park has introduced. Okay, so we will take a look at each topic, and I will show you a sample lesson that you can do in your class to address each topic. Like a topic one, this first topic deals with the following essential questions. What is the Korean American story? Who is Dr. Sammy Lee? What are the contribution of Dr. Lee to the US? And why does his contribution matter to us? I think it's always important to circle back to Korean time to make it more relevant to our students so they can understand better. So, and in the lesson that I'm about to share, in this lesson, students will be able to identify at least 3 contributions Dr. Lee has made to the US, discuss the Korean American experience in America in the early 20th century. And I have used 3 different lesson activities. One I will show you is a warm-up reflection, and then a double entry journal, and the next is sleep activities. Okay, to give you a little steps on, this is just a sample lesson, but you can begin this lesson with a warm-up reflection, giving students like 5 minutes to write about an immigrant that they know, or someone famous, or could be any person that they know who has contributed in some way to American society. It doesn't have to be Korean American, for any immigrant. And then call on the student volunteer to share their reflection, ask if any student can reflect on a Korean American, and then later start introducing the lesson topic and essential questions to students. And then explain that by the end of the lesson, students will be able to identify and all the lesson objective that I just shared. And then for this particular lesson, I did it in groups. So students will be placed into small group, and they'll be handed out some adaptive student reading. What that means is instead of the 20 pages long document, I have divided up. So this section has only 4 to 5 pages long that students can read individually or as a group. And while they're reading it though, one task they will be doing is using the double entry journals to jot down their notes or anything that teacher should clarify as a historical fact, they can do on this using double entry journal format. And then wrap up the lesson by asking students to divide the paper into 5 sections and synthesize what they have learned, what happens, what did Dr. Lee do, what are 3 ways Dr. Lee and his family contributed to American society, what I learned, what questions still have. So this is in a way so one full lesson, but I'm sure you can modify it depending on how what lesson you are teaching. But this is just to show you one example. So this is what double entry journal is. It's basically one column, you get the information or text information from the textbook or from the document. But on the right-hand side, you write, students reflect their own thinking. So it's their analysis part. They can reflect, analyze, interpret the quote or reaction and such a thing. So this is one fun activity that student can do. To show you where I've embedded the reading is here, early biography. If you click it, because of time, I'm going to not show each one click, but this live link will show you the section from the full document that pertain to this lesson. So this is one lesson that you can do with your students. And the topic 2, any questions? Do you have any question or any other ideas of elaborating or doing it for topic 1 from the audience?
I don't see a question, Dr. Cho, but I do have a comment. First of all, I think it's beautiful how you have a journal opportunity for students. I know that giving students writing opportunities is important in any school, but the process of writing, as Kelly Gallagher states, is writing is generative. Students don't just write what they know or what's in their mind, but the act of writing itself generates new thinking. And when it comes to race and ethnicity, I think it's so important for students to have that time and space. So I can see your lesson design of why you would incorporate writing as they go on this journey to explore and understand themselves.
Yes, thank you. So the topic 2, concentrating on the public laws discriminating against Asian immigrants in the early 20th century. If you look at the document that Dr. Park provided, tells all this history. So I think you will get all this information from that document. But how do segregation and discrimination individuals, families, and communities, covering up here, affect individuals, families, community in American society? And so in this lesson, you can do several things like sort chronologically some of the race-based segregation and restriction that existed since 1852. If you are teaching social science, discuss federal and state level public law that discriminated against Asian immigrants in the early 20th, and also compare the immigration experience of Asian Americans to other immigrants during 1900s and in present days. This is also, I have shortened that section so that it's more manageable for students to read and all that. For this topic, one way of introducing in this lesson is doing a think, pair, share. I'm sure many teachers, many of us do this, but it's a brainstorming key concepts or discuss key concepts with the students. And some of the key concepts can be white supremacy, race-based segregation, aliens ineligible for citizenship. What does that mean? Those things. And then the lecture can follow up, and whatever the key concept you choose, follow up with that. And the reading in here, I said that you can do some highlighting of the key terms and then doing it in discussion form. Follow up in groups, research on historical fact. So those are follow-up activities that they can do after the lesson is over. And this one is just a one way, another way of doing class activity with the reading. Because always if we give students to read, they're not going to read it unless they are busy doing something. So this is just a one way of doing it, quotation. So a student can choose like 5 quotation from each text, and they analyze, why do I find this quote interesting and important, and start sharing those. So that's just a simple sample to show you. Okay, let me see. And the topic 3, this one talks about more on Dr. Sammy Lee's contribution to diplomacy and how can diplomacy improve relations between American and the nations? How can diplomacy improve race relations within the US? That's the key essential questions for this lesson. And in this lesson, students can identify diplomatic strategies used by Dr. Lee, by the athletic field, discuss how diplomacy can help persuade people of color throughout the world that the US was no longer committed to white supremacy by the middle of the 20th century. That's one way of doing it. But for this time, instead of doing just a group, I'm sharing this jigsaw reading approach to read this entire biographical overview that Dr. Park have written. I don't know how many of us are familiar with the jigsaw reading approach, but it is effective to do this type of approach when we are reading really a lot of readings, large amount of readings. Then it is jigsaw reading approach is pretty effective in using it. Normally, you assign each home group a small section of and you give small section of the reading for the home group to discuss, and then later share with each other. How many of you are familiar with the jigsaw reading approach? I don't know whether I need to tell you more in details or whether you're familiar with, or later on, once I finish sharing mine, if I have to go back and give you more details about how reading a jigsaw reading approach, then I will explain to you at that time. Okay. Another way is think, pair, share. What is diplomacy? Because students might bring out different definition of what diplomacy is, And the lesson will be identify diplomatic strategies used, Dr. Sammy Lee. And then, for that also, it's always benefit if students have something to write and all that. So for this one, I did a similar to the one that I showed you, 2-column chart. Showing the benefit of diplomatic actions and using textual evidence to complete the chart. So it's similar to the one that I have shared, but let me see if I can share here. So how Sammy Lee contribute to diplomacies, and students will have to bring that information from the text. And then what the benefit, they can do it in groups or they can do it alone as a homework if the time doesn't permit. So from current one. And then, so that's what they can do, or they can do some discussion on how can diplomacy improve relation between Americans and other nations? How can diplomacy improve race relations within the US? And what is goodwill ambassador of the US means? What does it mean? And what were Dr. Lee's contribution to diplomacy, all that? And what was diplomacy look like in our classroom, coming back to current time, school community? What can be the consequences of not having healthy diplomacy? So these are some of those ideas that you can do with the materials that Dr. Park has developed. Some other extension activities that you can ask students to do is like write a short research paper in the following order, read Dr. Sammy Lee's biography. How did he handle the obstacles? What identities did he have? What is his legacy and long-term impact? How did his work change the US? Do you relate to Dr. Sammy Lee's? Why or why not? So these are some of the research papers that students can do and then share to the whole class. So you see different perspective about this lesson. Another one that I encountered was for doing this curriculum development was a children's book. There was a children's book that was written by Paula Yu. And the title was really interesting, 16 years in 16 seconds. So I think it was really interesting title, and it's a children's book and it's talking about Sammy Lee's, his biography. And this book includes how Dr. Lee has overcome his barriers and challenges he faced to achieve his goal and about the meaning of the book title. So it will be really interesting to have a discussion with the students about starting with the title. What does 16 years in 16 seconds means? And then engaging it with the lesson. So that's some sample lesson that I want to share. And the references, these are all live link. As I said, the whole entire text is here, but this one is I have broken down so that it will help you when you do the teaching. And some book, children's book. This was from Dr. John Park's list, some oral interviews that he did and all this. So any questions? I'm making it. Yes.
I was thinking we could open it up for questions for both Dr. Park and also for you, Dr. Cho,
yes,
at this time. But thank you so much for your portion. Wonderful how you broke up the lesson to have short lessons, long lessons, depending on what it is that the teacher would want to use, including a number of strategies for students to learn the material, writing strategies, speaking strategies, collaborative strategies, very active and engaging ways for students to access the content. So thank you for giving all those suggestions and ideas. So I do see a question in the chat, and I'm going to go ahead and, by the way, I'm seeing a lot of thank you. Dr. Rita saying thank you. Louisa, great resources. Hera saying great resources to both Dr. Park and Dr. Cho. So thank you so much for that. And at this time, if you have a question in your mind, feel free to unmute yourself and share out, or write the question in the public chat. And I'm going to go ahead and begin with this one here. Ms. Hera, did you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hello, Hera Kwan, Sunny Hills High School. I teach US history and government. And I have a question for Dr. Park. You mentioned that when he was acting as a kind of goodwill ambassador, he was, promoting the idea that the United States was no longer, I guess, racist or white supremacist. How did he feel about that? Because he was speaking at a time where, we could still argue that this is still very much a very real thing even today. It was definitely a much bigger reality, a much more in-your-face reality when Dr. Lee was, promoting the United States. Did he have any comments or thoughts on that?
Yes. And in multiple interviews, he made two broad points, which was that it's going to be a long process, right? So, and this is, his life does straddle that post-Brown period, right? So after Brown versus Board of Education, many white supremacist folks, or many Americans in general, did not particularly care for that decision. It was actually one of the most unpopular decisions, right? Desegregating public schools is not overwhelmingly popular in portions of the country, especially not in the South. And in those instances, people around the world could see that many people were attached to white supremacist practices and were not going to let them go. So Dr. Lee often conceded that this was going to be a long, long process. Yeah, and actually, like, I think if you're talking to junior high and high school students, you might ask them, where do you think we are in that process? Like, are we further along? Are we going backwards? And then the other point that Dr. Sammy Lee made was that it's true that the United States is white supremacist, but the wonderful thing about the US is that it might have self-correcting mechanisms, right? So as a democracy, as people of color voted, as there was no such thing as an alien ineligible for citizenship after 1952, as the United States became more open to a wider range of people from around the world, right? The best part of America may be that America in the future, not so much what it was in the past, and that people of color and people like him were, at least in pretty obvious ways, they were welcome to contribute. So again, I think like for junior high and high school students, right, that's a very powerful take on what the United States is, right? Should we go back to like try to make America great again, which is, I don't know when that was, or do we look forward to an America that is more inclusive, that is more racially fair, just, yeah. So that would be my reply.
Thank you, Dr. Park, for that challenge to do better for the next generation. I'm seeing in the public chat, Sarah Park Dallin sharing that she has an author friend, Paula Yu, who's a good friend. Sarah, did you want to share on that real quick?
Oh, I was just saying, Paula Yu is the author of the 16 Years and 16 Seconds book. And she's a phenomenal presenter, and she gives she does really great class visits. She guest lectured in my class last spring. I teach graduate students on her newest book, Vincent Chin. But I'm texting with her right now and like telling her about this webinar, and she has presentations on Sammy Lee that she could do. And right now she's only doing Zoom visits, but if anyone wants to invite her to their classroom, she's always happy to do class visits. So that's all.
No, thank you so much for sharing that resource, Dr. Grace. We're definitely going to have her as a resource. And Mi-Young Kim is also affirming the book, 16 Years and 16 Seconds, that it was very effective in the school that she taught in as well. So thank you for sharing that resource. And it's been tested in the classroom as well as a good resource material. I know we have only a couple minutes left. So any final thoughts or questions before I hand it over to Ginny Shim for evaluations?
I see Clara.
I have a question.
Yes, please, Clara.
Can you hear me? Thank you very much for this wonderful webinar and for this incredibly informative session. I am a good friend of Grace Cho. Thank you, Grace, for that great presentation. I'm here as a mother of two Chinese Americans, two daughters that I adopted from China. And so my connection to your work comes from being the mother of two Chinese American daughters. And I wanted to ask you a couple of things, and we don't have time for this right now, but I would love to hear about the two brothers that presented this afternoon, talked about their mother and talked about the work, the silent sacrificial work of their mother. I would love to grab a latte with both of you and talk about the work of your mother. I'm sure this is not the time right now because we don't have time, but as a mother of two Chinese Americans, I would love to learn vicariously through you, through the eyes of your mother. The other thing is my husband is African American and he teaches ethnic studies in LA Unified School District in secondary. And so he has found himself that he doesn't have resources for Korean American information. He's a Black man and he's trying to learn, like I'm trying to learn. And so do you have any advice for us on how do we do this? The students don't have books. They don't have any real immediate OERs for Korean American ethnic studies. So if you would be able to share some information with that, that'd be great too. Thank you.
That's our next project, actually. we will be developing reference book and resource book for teachers. That's our next task. But later on, we will be making all our lesson plans. I know we only showed a little sample of it, since it's only 30-minute presentation, but we do have a fully developed lesson plan that we can share to the public, but we are still in the editing stage. It's the initial stage. So as soon as we are done and we publish, we will let you guys know. And we plan to develop a website to store all those and share with all of you.
Thank you.
Awesome. And then also Dr. Ed Park, Dr. John Park, that's maybe your next research project, stories from a Korean American mother and lessons to be learned for our country. So that could be a next research topic. So thank you for sharing that, Clara. I hope everyone also, had the opportunity to just really acknowledge how each of our speakers today, Dr. Ed Park, Dr. John Park, Dr. Grace Cho, shared their why of their involvement in this work. Now, I've worked with Dr. Ed Park for over 10 years. I've never heard him share his why like this before. So there's something that he's really resonating, deeply connecting with this work. And I want to encourage all of you as well, even myself, to do the same as well. The why. Why Korean American studies? Why is this important? Because this is a story to tell. I know when Dr. Ed Park shared, Dr. John Park, Dr. Cho is sharing, it resonates and touches our hearts too, right? And so that's why it's so important for you to know your story, your why, because it's going to touch your community when they know your why as well, because I know each one of you have your story as well. I know getting very close to our time. So once again, let's give a big round of applause to our speakers for today. Dr. Ed Park, Dr. John Park, and Dr. Grace Cho. Let's give them a big warm welcome and actually warm applause and gratitude. And thank you so much for your service and leadership in this area, your scholarship. Appreciate you guys so much and paving the way for so many. I now hand it over to Ginny Shim for any logistical issues.
Yeah, I just shared in the chat. Thank you for attending today, and please fill out the following evaluation. We do this weekly, and especially if you are trying to go for the salary point, this is mandatory, so please do so. If you have any questions about any slides, please first look at our website. I'll share the website link again, and the website has all the presenter slides, including today's and previous weeks. And I'm doing my best to upload all the recordings of each session, and that'll always be uploaded onto our YouTube channel. I'll also put a link to our YouTube channel on that same website. And that's all I have.
All right, this is session webinar 3 of 7. So see you guys next week, where we're going to learn more about Korean Americans and great American stories.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Jeannie. Oh,
Thank
I'm
you,
sorry.
everybody.
Jeannie, can I ask a
Bye.
question?
Thank you.
Yeah, hi, Helen.
Hi, I'm sorry. I was driving and I'm just arrived.